I work with employers on a global basis. Large, small, medium-sized, anybody, anywhere in the world who is looking to change and drive and deliver a global D&I strategy. But today I've been asked just to speak to you about analytics, and something that's cropped up on a number of sessions earlier in the day, and something that we were talking about earlier is transparency. Is it always a good thing? I think the general consensus would be, but there are points where it's not always going to be the case. And I just want to touch on analytics and also why we're doing this. Because analytics itself is just a collection of a data set. It doesn't do anything, it doesn't drive change. All it does is highlight what's actually going on at any one particular place and time. And the only real value we get is from the data that we gather. And analysis in its own right doesn't achieve anything. The data in its own right doesn't achieve anything. It's the quality of the data that we get, how we analyze it, and then most importantly, what we choose to do with it. Sometimes it's just for compliance. Sometimes it's just an internal issue. Do we want this for reporting purposes? But if we want to drive change in the organizations that we work for, that I represent and work with, then we have to work out what we're going to do with these particular things. And the first hurdle that we always come up with is, well, can we actually collect this data? You can, but not all over the world. There are different countries where you're not allowed to. Germany, France, you can't ask any of these particular questions that identifies anybody or any of their individual characteristics. In the UK, it's quite a long-standing tradition. We can do this. Should we do this? I think we should. And how do we do this is something that I will come on to in a little bit. But the case for data, anyway, is, and I do find a lot of organizations internally struggle to actually make the case, why should we go and collect this? But from my perspective and ENEI's perspective, it is for any employer who wants to create an inclusive environment, then the data monitoring is an absolutely integral tool. If you cannot justify what you're saying, you're not going to be able to affect the change that we are all trying to do. It gives you a deeper insight into the working life of those people who have a particular protected characteristic. They're not always going to come forward. They're not going to say, this is what I'm dealing with on a day-to-day basis. But this analysis, this data, can help you to identify those particular things. And the other thing it does is it sends a signal of alliance. So if I'm asking you this, it's important to me as an organization. You have to be able to engender trust in what you're going to do with that. You have to explain the case for why you're doing it. But if you present it in the right kind of way, it does engender trust. It does form that alliance with the people that you are trying to work with and help. As I mentioned, global data. Global data is an absolute minefield. But as with any global diversity and inclusion strategy, what you'll find is 60 to 70% of what you do is best practice globally, and data collection is pretty much the same. You have to be very careful of the particular countries. There are some very obvious ones. If you wanted somebody from an LGBT employee and they wanted somebody over to be an engineer in Saudi Arabia, you'd have to have particular consideration to whether they were comfortable with it, what they wanted to do, bearing in mind them just being there is illegal. You've got particular issues, a lot of organizations, particularly US ones, not to pick on any particular country, that say what we do in our country is best practice. So we are going to do the same thing globally. And I grew up in Africa, and what you'll find is over there, people don't care so much about race. They've got a whole host of different issues that they're dealing with. Some of them are tribal, some of them are ethnic, but race is not so much the problem that it is, or we believe it to be, from a UK or a US standpoint. So you have to be aware of what the social norms are, what the cultural and the legal requirements are if you're going to start looking at data and global collection. And I think you should. It's something that you should persevere with. What you find works in one particular country can teach you. And if we take a step away from that cultural colonialism that Western companies can have, which is our way is the best, what we can do is we find through this data analysis that other people are perhaps doing it better. We can bring that best practice back into our own headquarters, and we can actually change what is going on out there. So the other thing to bear in mind is with data collection, I'm working with a lot of clients now who are looking at artificial intelligence. It's something that's going to become bigger and bigger. So, for example, if you want to get the best out of any one of your members of staff, you need to make sure they have two things, and they're counterintuitive actually. But one of them is they need to feel unique. So if I'm a 75-year-old gay black man and I work for your particular company, then I want to be a 75-year-old gay black man, and I want to be exactly who I am. But the other thing that you need to have is a sense of belonging. And this comes back to a lot of what Trevor was saying earlier, and the culture, and who is responsible for this. And as in 5 years' time, I'm pretty sure that every company that's represented here will have a chief cultural officer on the board. They don't have them now, but somebody is going to say, you need to take responsibility for this culture. And it's that culture that will drive who comes to work for you, which customers want to buy your products, where you want to base yourself around the world, and more importantly, how your employees feel as if they belong. So I want to feel unique, but I also want to feel I belong. And people in the modern workplace are going to be very picky about who they go and work for. Customers are getting more and more picky about who they buy from. So this culture becomes more and more relevant to you, your organizations, as you go forward. And data analytics, just for example, Sam was talking just now about agile working. Flexible working I dislike because I think it's one of the most inflexible things out there. But agile working, which means I will judge you on what you deliver, you decide how you're going to deliver it. If you want to take the kids to school, you want to be up late, you want to do this overnight, you want to do it from a beach in Cyprus, I really don't care. It's entirely up to you how you want to go and do it. What analytics tells us is you do that in the first year, you will have a 12% uplift in productivity and an 8% uplift in profitability in your organizations. It's a perk for you, not for the individual that you're doing it. Slightly off topic, sorry. So gender pay gap, we've touched on this a lot. All I'm going to say is if you've got a big problem, you've got to stand up there and you just need to own up to it. Everybody's going to have a pay gap. Actually, that's not strictly true. I know some that won't. But everybody will have something. You just need to stand up and say, this is what we've got. This is the plan for what we're going to do about it. This is what we want to achieve. And people will overlook now. You will be forgiven. Not in 3 or 4 years' time, but now is the time to say, okay, I will publish, I will stand up, I'll be counted and say, this is the change that I want to implement. What you have to be careful of as well is what other kind of reporting we're going to do. So we're talking currently about ethnicity reporting and the pay gap around that. Then you've got to ask questions about intersectionality. How do I describe myself? How do you describe yourself? Which box am I going to tick? Because the biggest box is always, I do not want to answer that question, or however you phrase it on your particular things. So that adds some real danger around making assumptions. If nobody feels comfortable enough in your organization to tick that particular box, then you're not going to find anything out. And your data becomes useless. And just one slight anecdote, actually, as I think Trevor was saying earlier. I had somebody that wouldn't answer any of the particular boxes in a corporate role that I did before. I actually had them apply for a job via their mother. They were extremely autistic, and I never knew who they were. I never knew their name. They never ticked any particular boxes. One of the best employees we ever had. Great actuary, did an absolutely amazing job. No idea who this person was, never met them. So while the data is important, it's the quality of your data that you really need to be aware of before you start making these particular decisions. The global challenge, as I mentioned, the legislation is key. You need to be aware of, you need to take legal advice, or you need to get some advice on how to go about catching this, because you do not want to fall foul of local legislation. And there is a reliability issue that goes with that. So when you take your data, you just need to be sure of what it is you've actually asked. So, for example, there was I won't name them, but a big global organization recently did an agile working, comes back to agile working study. So how many employees come under this? The question they didn't ask was, in the local legislation, is this a prerequisite? Do you have to provide this? Oh, sorry, we didn't ask that. All the data suddenly becomes worthless, because if you're being told to do it, that is not showing you the attitude of the organization and what it is they're trying to achieve. So, so driving change. There is an expectation of transparency for employers. I still don't believe we live in this big glass box where everybody knows everything. I do believe culture and values are things that people always aspire to, but everybody has values. Enron had values. They were chiseled into marble in the floor. What you really see and where you really see the values are who gets promoted, who gets hired, who gets paid, who gets looked after. What is actually going on inside there. So this transparency will come back, not necessarily in the data, but if you do that, you attract, and you will attract the best talent, and this is becoming more and more prevalent as the millennials really take over the marketplace, because this is incredibly important to the next generation and the generation after those. So just hold the mirror up to yourself. You don't have to be scared of what you're finding out. It's just the starting point, at which point you can move forwards and say, we will learn from what we have you'll meet the legal requirements, and you'll improve as you go. Now, the next thing, and slightly controversially, I do want to ask is transparency always the best way? Now, for those of you that don't work internationally, you may not be aware, but New York State, at the end of November, introduced legislation which is you are not allowed to ask in a job interview what the person previously earned. The reason behind this was to try and close the gender pay gap. So you've got, well, the thought process being, if we don't know what you were earning, we are going to pay you what it is that you are, that the job is worth, irrespective of what you earned before. Because we always find, let's say there's an average of a 30% pay gap between people in equal roles, men and women. A huge broad brush, so bear with me. But then people move every 3 years. I'm going to move to a new job. Every time I move, I'm going to get a 10% pay rise. By the time you've had 5 jobs, the woman in that equation is 50% behind where she would have been. The pay gap is widening and widening. So transparency, not always the best thing. I do have a couple of issues with that because I don't think you should ever be allowed to say, because you can volunteer the information, which means if you've got, you were high pay, you're going to tell people. If you weren't, you won't. So it can come back and haunt you, but it is a step in the right direction. But the question that I wanted to leave you with is always, just because we live in a world of transparency, it may not always be the best way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.